Welcome, everyone. We have a really exciting podcast planned for you today. We have the most incredible Dr. Sarah Buckley joining us, and I feel very privileged for many reasons today, because Sarah, you were one of the first guests that we interviewed, and when you said yes, it was just a highlight for me, and I know a highlight for everyone who had the privilege of watching the film as well. So we're so grateful to have you joining us today, and also for your participation in the film. It would not be what it is today without your incredible wisdom that you shared. And your generosity as well with your time. So thank you so much for all of the work that you've done.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for coming around to my kitchen to interview me. That was a cool
It's
day.
a really lovely kitchen, isn't it?
It's beautiful. Yeah. I think, were you mid-renovations as well during that time?
I think we just finished renovating,
Yeah. Thank you. And I think we'd met once in person as well. And just like for you to offer up your space as well, you're just the best. Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
So I'll dive into your bio as well. I'm sure everyone is aware of the incredible work that you've done over decades now. You trained as a family physician, a GP, with qualifications in GP-obstetrics. Sarah has been writing and lecturing in childbirth professionals and parents since 1997, and also the author of the internationally best-selling book, one of my favorites still, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering. Sarah has a special interest in the hormones of the physiological labour and birth and the impacts of maternity care interventions. She's currently a PhD candidate for the University of Queensland, researching oxytocin in labour and birth and the implications of interventions. She has co-authored several papers on oxytocin in labour and birth and breastfeeding, and is the author of the 2015 report, Hormonal Physiology of Childbirth. And you were also a mother of 4 adult children, and all of them were born at home.
Amazing.
Aren't I lucky?
That's probably the most impressive for me. I'm like, wow. Wow. How
Well,
incredible.
I think luck is one thing, but also informed.
Yeah, incredibly informed.
Certainly. I mean, I'm a medical doctor, as you know, and my husband's a medical doctor. And actually when we had our first baby, we'd recently done our GP-obstetric training in hospital. So we kind of knew all the things that could go wrong, and we knew all the ways that hospitals might contribute to some of those things. So having our babies at home was a bit of a no-brainer in some ways. And I got halfway through the pregnancy, I thought maybe we should consider going to hospital. Anyway, we decided not to. But we're also supported by my sister-in-law, my husband's sister, who was a home birth midwife in New Zealand for decades as well. So very much encouraged and supported. And we'd also actually supported a couple of friends having their babies at home, and really got to see the difference in home birth. You know, all the things I say about being private, safe and unobserved, and how that really plays out in home birth. And then, you know, what happens in hospital just from being in that foreign environment that's so unphysiological and kind of unevolutionary as well.
Yeah, 100%. Every time you talk, I'm just nodding. Yes, that's exactly right. Oh, so good. Well, we thought we'd firstly dive into your research into oxytocin. That was one of the amazing topics we explored in the film. So we have heard a bit about it, but I would love to know why you initially chose it to be a research topic, and what are some of the more unexpected things you discovered through your research?
Yeah, great question. So I guess I chose oxytocin, well, one, because there's the most research in childbirth in relation to oxytocin. I mean, it was first discovered as a hormone of childbirth, like oxyfast, tocin birth, so all of that. And the second thing is I've had this incredible privilege of working with a woman, Kirsten Uvnas-Moberg, who's like the worldwide expert in oxytocin, and joining her and her research team doing what's called systematic reviews, which I'll explain in a minute, on oxytocin. So, yeah, these incredible opportunities that have come to me through my PhD. And so a systematic review is a research methodology where you use particular techniques to kind of cast a wide net through the literature, everything that's been published, and find the studies that you're interested in. So what we did was we've done systematic reviews, finding all the studies that actually measured women's oxytocin levels in labour. So first of all, in labour with no interventions in physiological birth. We actually did one on breastfeeding as well, and then one on birth with interventions. And we found just whatever there is there, like we can't make up research that doesn't exist, but there were quite a few studies on, for example, synthetic oxytocin, which is a paper that we've published already, on cesareans, which is a paper I've just submitted. The one I'm working on at the moment is epidurals and opioids. And we also found some studies on the effect of prostaglandins on oxytocin, things like rupture of membranes, vaginal examination, some of those things as well were part of the studies that have been done, some older studies. But in fact, what we found was the older studies were actually the best. They were done with the most rigorous scientific techniques, including the best assays. So assays is basically how you figure out the measurement system that you use. And these older studies used high-quality assays. They used this thing called radioimmunoassay, RIA, which gives the most valid results. Whereas if you look at the newer ones, well, there weren't many newer studies actually in all of everything we looked at. There weren't many studies after about 1990, after 2000 really. But the newer studies tended to use a different method of assay called ELISA, enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, but really not so, consistent results, not so valid results especially in terms of childbirth. So they weren't so useful. So thank goodness for those researchers, especially this German team that did these fantastic, really rigorous studies. And thank you to the women who had their blood sampled through labour and birth, right? It's not an easy thing to do, and especially in the pushing stage, and some women even it was, in the hour after birth. So yeah, a really great pool of research there. And as I said, then our job was to kind of divide them up into physiologic birth and then the various interventions. And that's what that's the main substance of my thesis.
And so what were some of the things that you ended up discovering that you thought, whoa, like I didn't even know that I was going to learn about this when I started?
Yes, well, it's interesting because in those early studies, they actually thought that oxytocin was the system that caused labour to start. And now we know that the system that causes labour to start is not known, right? We don't even know what the system is that causes labour to start, which is kind of ironic when we're stepping over it with scheduled birth and inductions and pre-labour cesareans. But anyway, it's not oxytocin. Oxytocin's part of the mixture. So what happens as pregnancy progresses, that was one of our findings. There was a gradual increase in oxytocin levels as women become towards the end of pregnancy. And this is to do with the hormone estrogen. So again, as we get closer to term, we get an upregulation, increase in estrogen activity, and that in turn steps up, or we say upregulates the oxytocin system. So that increase in pregnancy was quite a distinct finding, and other individual studies or like more recent studies haven't necessarily been able to document that in the way that these studies did. So that was interesting. And the other really interesting finding was that the levels of oxytocin when women go into labour are not that high. They're actually quite low. And the reason for that, and this is part of another major finding, is because at that stage, the woman about to go into labour has these extremely high levels of oxytocin sensitivity and extremely high levels of uterine oxytocin receptors. And I'll just explain what that is, right? A hormone is a substance made of one part of the body with effects at another part, and it has effects by binding to a receptor. And I say it's like a key and a lock. So you have the key, the oxytocin molecule. You have the lock, the oxytocin receptor. The oxytocin molecule, in terms of labour and birth, is actually released from the brain. So it travels to the uterus. It finds the oxytocin receptors, like the locks on the outside of the uterine muscle cell. It binds to those locks and sends a chemical message into the cell saying contract. So that's how oxytocin released from the brain causes the contractions of labour. And we've been talking about oxytocin levels, right? So levels can go up and down. But as I mentioned, receptor numbers go up and down. And the more receptors there are, the more sensitive that tissue is. And that's really why that we found that levels actually aren't that high at the onset of labour. And I'll just share an anecdote about that. So I breastfed through my second pregnancy, and every morning my little toddler would come in and have a little suckle. That was fine. But the morning I went into labour, she came in and asked for a suckle, and I said yes. And I literally had to throw her off. I got the most massive contraction. So the day before, my uterus wasn't sensitive to the oxytocin released by suckling. The day of labour, hugely increased. And in terms of numbers, from late pregnancy to early labour, it's about 3 times. And from beginning of pregnant, so from non-pregnant through to through to the end of pregnancy, it's like hundreds of times increase. So, this is really important that the uterus in pregnancy and in labour is got this exquisite sensitivity to oxytocin. So not only do levels, physiological levels, not have to be high to make contractions happen, we'll talk about that a bit more, but the other corollary of that is you can't give a woman very much synthetic oxytocin, the drug, which is chemically equivalent to oxytocin, because of the sensitivity, like amounts of synthetic oxytocin you could give to an adult outside of labour, massive amounts, 40, 50 units, but you couldn't give that to a labouring woman because of the sensitivity, which basically means that whatever you give her, she hasn't got very much. Her blood levels aren't that high. So we'll come back to that when we talk about synthetic oxytocin. But that whole sensitivity was certainly a bit of an unexpected finding. And I guess the other the other implications of everything that we found was not just about the effects of oxytocin on the body, but we incorporated everything that we know since the discovery of oxytocin as this uterine contracting hormone, everything we know about oxytocin subsequently, about its effects in the brain, because that's really been where the oxytocin research has been in the last few decades. And it hasn't really been applied to childbirth. So, we know oxytocin as a feel-good hormone of love. That name was actually given by I like to mention her name, pioneering oxytocin researcher Niles Newton, who was a psychologist. She found out lots of things about oxytocin, including that you can inhibit its release, for example, during breastfeeding by putting your feet in buckets of iced water. Right? When she was breastfeeding, she thought, I wonder if it inhibits it. And yes, it did. So stress inhibits oxytocin. We can come back to that. But she did all these experiments, and we might come back to these as well, actually with animals and stressing animals in birth and what happens to the progress of labour. For example, she had mice and put them in these big glass jars, and she put the smell like swabs with cat urine in, and it really, how did that disturb their birthing? You can imagine they didn't feel, private, safe and unobserved, obviously, and their birthing was really slower and more babies died. These are polytocus species that give birth to lots of young. So she taught us lots about oxytocin, and she developed that phrase, the hormone of love, because oxytocin is a hormone of making babies, having babies, breastfeeding our babies, and attachment. Every mammalian species, oxytocin is a mammalian hormone. Oxytocin is essential for mother-baby attachment. So all these effects include not just the body, but the brain as well. So in the brain, oxytocin is we call it a neuromodulator. So it shifts everything around in the brain. And specifically, it turns down the stress systems, which is the sympathetic, the fight or flight system, and turns up the opposite, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. We'll come back to that in labour. But it also turns down the medium-term stress hormone, the cortisol system. And one of the studies that we looked at in breastfeeding was really beautiful. They measured women's levels, oxytocin levels during breastfeeding, and they rise quite early. You get the letdown reflex. Even sometimes, when you're breastfeeding, just hearing your baby or thinking about your baby can give you a letdown, right? So those oxytocin levels go up quite quickly and gradually subside over about 20 minutes. And in this study, the cortisol levels and the oxytocin levels were basically mirror images of each other. So as oxytocin went up, cortisol went down. So breastfeeding has this calming, connecting, all the effects of oxytocin in the brain as well. So neuromodulating is turning down stress. Oxytocin's been called an anti-stress system. In the brain, also pain relieving, which is helpful in labour and birth. It also reduces all those parasympathetic things, which is the autonomic nervous system. I'll just go back a step. That's like the automatic nervous system, right? It regulates all those things we don't have to think about, like our blood pressure, our heart rate, our gut function, our skin temperature. So that's balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic being the activating fight or flight system, so parasympathetic being the soothing, calming, rest and digest, calm and connection system. So the brain, when we have these increases in oxytocin, it spreads very much widespread throughout the brain, and it does this neuromodulating. So in labour, we get this decrease in stress, to help labor is an intense event for every mammal, right? There's no other way out for the babies than through these, powerful contractions of labor. So Mother Nature puts in every bit of help that she can. So this whole anti-stress system that kicks in labor through oxytocin benefits the laboring mother. And not only that, but what we found was that the parasympathetic nervous system almost like independently contributes to labor. So the more parasympathetic there is, the more uterine contractions there is. So the more sympathetic, and this makes sense, doesn't it? The more fight or flight there is, the less contractions there is. And sometimes I call that the saber-toothed tiger effect. Like, for any mammal giving birth in the wild, birth is kind of risky. Like this, the laboring female, it's hard for her to respond to a threat, like she's making strange noises, strange smells that would attract predators. So it's very important for her that she's sensitive to her external cues and to the presence of danger. So if she does detect danger and the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, then that's going to slow down or stop labor. And alternatively, during labor and birth, when the parasympathetic nervous system is there, it's going to help to promote contractions. So that's happening all the way through labor, as well as oxytocin, as well as the pain relieving effects. But the other interesting thing about oxytocin in the brain is it triggers, and I might have mentioned this in the film, it stimulates the reward and pleasure centers, the dopamine, opioid centers in the brain. And what that means, and by the way, in the lead up to labor, we talked about the increase of uterine oxytocin receptors. Well, in animals, we can't test this in women. There's an increase in brain oxytocin receptors because oxytocin has all of these effects, through the body in the brain. So as these brain oxytocin levels go up, and in fact, as I said, the brain is more sensitive because the increase in receptors, we get this increase in the brain pleasure and reward centers, the mesocorticolimbic dopamine-related centers. And what that means is at that moment of birth, the mother has, and all mammals we're talking here, this maximum activation of the pleasure and reward centers. And then she meets her babies for the first time and she gets all that sensory input, like the smell, the feeling, the sight, even the taste, like most mammals lick their babies. And then that gets fired and wired, connected up together with the reward and pleasure centers. And what that means is from the very beginning, those babies are a source of pleasure and reward for her. And that's why all mammals take care of their babies, right? Like every mammalian baby is born in an immature state and needs this dedicated maternal care. And this is the system that rewards and motivates every mammalian mother to take care of her babies without having to go to classes or learn how to do it right. So, dogs, cats, elephants, birth happens, they take care of their babies and in the right circumstances, unless they're in a zoo or the birth is really messed up with, but because of these peaks of oxytocin at the end of labor. So as I said, it's a hormone of attachment in all mammals. And those things are kind of harder to figure out in humans because we have so many ways of relating to our children. Like we can form bonds with children that we haven't given birth to, right? But there is this system, this biological mammalian system of bonding to our babies, of maternal adaptations that help the mother to take care of her babies. And oxytocin is one of them. All of these systems optimize not just birth, but the initiation of breastfeeding. There's a whole lot of things that happen in the first hour after birth. I can talk about that as well. That will promote the initiation of breastfeeding, which is, again, an oxytocin system. So every breastfeed or lactation that the mother does is reinforcing this oxytocin system. The mother's getting this pleasure and reward, and all of the parasympathetic, actually a reduction in blood pressure, a slowing of the heart rate. And the other interesting thing is the increase in blood flow to the skin. So remember I said the autonomic nervous system regulates blood flow to our skin, and that's very much sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. The skin is innervated with the sympathetic nervous system. So when that goes down, we get more blood flow to our skin. So some people use that as a marker of our autonomic nervous system, like how warm is our skin, how moist is our skin, how much blood flow is it getting. So in terms of labour and birth, when the labouring mother, and we're talking women here, gets these peaks of oxytocin in labour and birth, she gets the ability to release oxytocin in skin-to-skin contact with her baby. So baby's born, natural, physiological, evolutionary for all mammals, a baby on the mother's body, and the mother's heat with the newborn baby on the body literally pulses heat to her baby to keep her baby warm. Because again, through evolution, there's no bunny rugs, no hats, no warmers. It's a mother's body heat that keeps the baby warm, and the cooler the baby is, the more heat the mother pulses to the baby. It's mutual regulation. But that only happens because of the peaks in the mother's probably brain, we think, in late labour. And we know that because other papers we've reviewed looked at mother's oxytocin levels in relation to caesarean, and women who had a pre-labour caesarean didn't increase their oxytocin in skin-to-skin contact with their baby. So that whole system wasn't turned on. So that's one of the maternal adaptations. And a second one I want to mention is actually a change in personality. So if you think about the kind of things we need to take care of our babies, Mother Nature's thought of it first, right? So women who go through physiological birth become less tense, less anxious. They report more sociability, right? They seek out social relationships, which is with the baby, right? Social relationships with the baby, social relationships with others are going to take care of her as well. And oxytocin, by the way, is a social affiliative hormone in all mammals as well, and encourages us to get together and kind of rewards us when we do. So those personality changes happen through these peaks of oxytocin at the end of labour and birth. And so that's a lot of the things that we learned. And there's a whole another body of work around the hour after birth. Do you want me to talk about that as well?
Yeah, well, I thought first, because it's so fascinating and there's so much to cover, but I thought just to recap for the listeners, if we just go through the labour and birth, just what environmental factors would be needed for those systems to operate in their optimal. So obviously, hopefully, a natural birth or a natural start in the labour. But then once the labour has begun, what does the body need to be able to have that undisturbed birth?
Yeah, well, two ways of responding to that. One is an evolutionary way. So as I kind of alluded to, we're mammals. We're actually placental mammals. We give birth to large, live young. And as far as we know, placental mammals have been around for about 65 million years. So that's how long human birth has been evolving for. And for 99.99999% of that time, we've been in the wild, right? So the labouring female needs to be very sensitive to her environment, to know she's in the safest place possible to give birth. And that means she's very sensitive to her surroundings. Like, sometimes labouring women can have this like supersonic hearing, right? They can hear something said in the room next door, right?
Yeah.
And she has to be, right? She has to know she's in the safest place possible. So that's why I say that the core requirements for birth in all mammals is that the labouring female feels private, safe, and unobserved. And those things are going to keep her sympathetic system low, allow oxytocin and the parasympathetic to progress labour. Yeah, so that's going to be the environment that she needs, and kind of how we might operationalise that in the human world. Well, obviously, the most private, safe, and unobserved one might feel would be in your own bedroom, right? So that's really why birth at home is so successful. Women have a much better time. Labour's more spontaneous labour and birth, much lower rates of intervention when women are in their home environment. And no other animal would go out of its own environment, would go to a strange place with strangers and strange noises and smells and all those things that actually, activate the limbic system. It's like a red alert to the limbic system to do that in labour. And yet that's kind of what we provide for women. So having that private, safe, and unobserved. I'm just going to add a little tip here. If you are going into hospital, there's a big risk that your labour will slow down or even stop at that point. So what you want to do is protect your senses, with the input to your limbic system, which is where all these hormones are getting made. So, you want to protect your smell. Take a smell of someone you know and love, a T-shirt, a pillow to bury your head in, take headphones, listen to something, take an eye mask, protect yourself as much as possible from that very strange, unbiological, unevolutionary environment. And take people that can care for you. take people that are familiar to you, not just your partner or your family, but I would highly recommend ideally your own midwife or at least a doula if you're going into a hospital setting, as to make that environment into something that's going to be the most conducive to physiological labour and birth. And just one more tip, which is that this hormonal process I'm describing in terms of labour and birth is very similar, in fact, almost identical to the hormonal process of making a baby, and that point of birth is actually like sexual orgasm, the same thing, this big rush of oxytocin. And so we could think of birth as a sexual event, which it actually is, because not just this, but it's all the sexual parts of our body, right?
Yeah.
So we could consider, is the place I'm planning to have a baby the kind of place where I could actually make a baby? And looking at through that lens, like, how can I make this more conducive to that kind of intimacy and that kind of privacy, and as I described in the film, yeah, dark, private, safe, unobserved, and often women that go to hospital, especially with their first birth, which is the most sensitive, right, they'll choose the smallest place they can, the shower, the toilet, to give birth. They'll actually know that protecting themselves is important. And another tip from the outtakes at the end of the film, if you haven't seen it, is to take a vibrator to hospital with you. This is from my friend Deborah Pascali Bonaro, who made the film Orgasmic Birth, and put it on the bed, and if that doesn't clear the room, turn it on. Sexual activity produces oxytocin, and it's much more fun than getting synthetic oxytocin through a drip, right?
Totally. Yes. Oh, gosh, yes. You have to see the film if you haven't seen it. That moment is so good. Okay, so just to recap, we know obviously the body is amazing. It has so many systems in place to make the start of labour, the whole labour process and birth optimal. Can you touch on the breastfeeding? So after birth, the postpartum, what's important to know?
Yes. So, again, going back to our mammalian heritage, obviously 65 million years, we've survived that, and other mammalian species have survived. So, for survival of the species, obviously we need birth to be successful. The mother's survives and the babies survive. But that's not enough. So the offspring have to survive and thrive and go on to have more offspring who survive and thrive. And that depends on successful lactation, which is breastfeeding. And also we talked about maternal infant attachment. The mothers have to be rewarded and motivated to give that dedicated care to protect their babies. So all the brain oxytocin reward and pleasure that we talked about as well. And the hour after birth, or the time after birth, is what we call an early sensitive period, when the mother and baby are in this actually exceptional state that optimizes the initiation of breastfeeding and the initiation of bonding. And we've got these big peaks of oxytocin. I've got to describe the oxytocin cycle before we go further, which I haven't said. So during labor, I describe labor as like a snowball. It starts small, becomes bigger and bigger, and in the end becomes virtually unstoppable. If you've had a baby, you might recognize this. Even if you want to stop it, you can't at that stage, right? So what happens in the mother's body in relation to oxytocin is we have positive feedback cycles that fuel the snowball of labor. I'm just going to go back to high school biology. So the concept of homeostasis, right? We're all sitting here, our blood pressure's even, our heart rate's even. There was suddenly a loud noise, we'd get a fright, our heart rate would go up, our blood pressure would go up, we'd be ready for fight or flight. Then we've got systems in our body that detect that unnecessary, high levels and bring it down. So that's a negative feedback cycle. Too high, bring it down. But in labor, the reason that the labor accelerates and the snowball gets bigger and bigger is instead of negative feedback cycles, we have positive feedback cycles. So one of the most well-known one is, you might know it as the Ferguson reflex. So basically what's happening as labor progresses, the contractions are strong, and the sensations from the contractions, so the increasing pressure in the lower vagina and cervix gets fed back to the brain by a specific nerve pathway. It's actually a parasympathetic nerve pathway. And when that information gets back to the brain, it tells the brain to release more oxytocin. So get more oxytocin released from the brain to the uterus, stronger contractions, more sensations. You might have noticed this yourself in labor, stronger sensations, and that feeds into more contractions, and the snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the same time, the other brilliant thing about this feedback cycle is at the same time that oxytocin is being released from the brain to make the contractions stronger, it's being released in the brain. So as the contractions get stronger, there's more calming, connecting, pain relieving, reward and pleasure center activation happening in the brain at the same time. So it's a brilliant system. And what that means is by the time we get to the end of physiological labor and birth, the oxytocin levels, as far as we can measure them, are about 4 times higher than what they were at the start of labor. And that's only what we can measure because oxytocin is actually released in pulses, and the pulses are probably much higher than what we can possibly measure. And there was one study, got to thank the women who did this, that was, you certainly wouldn't get ethics approval these days, but they actually fed a catheter, a little tube, through the blood vessels to the jugular vein in the neck, and they sampled the woman's oxytocin levels from the jugular vein in the neck, and they were like 8 to 10 times higher than what you'd sample from the periphery. So when it's getting released from the brain, it's very high in the jugular vessels, and then kind of gets more diluted as it goes through. But if we could measure it in the brain, it would be multiple times higher. Yeah, but you've got to measure very frequently and blah, 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 difficult to do in labour. So these peaks of labour at birth, 3 to 4 times higher, according to the studies, than what it was at the start of labour. So at that point, when the mother's giving birth, at the pushing stage, her baby's come out and she's got this maximum pleasure and reward centre activation, as I say it's like the best first date ever, right? She's got this maximum reward and pleasure centre activation, and actually the baby does too. The baby at birth has even higher oxytocin levels than the mother. So during labour and birth, inevitable stresses for the baby and probably the massage-like effects of the contractions cause this increase in the baby's oxytocin. So that hour after birth, mother and baby have got these high levels of oxytocin. And on top of that, for the baby also has high levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, the catecholamine hormones. And that's actually I won't go into it in detail, but that's a really important protective mechanism in labour and birth to protect the baby's brain, prepare the baby for life outside the womb. But what that means is that the baby at birth not only has high levels of the kind of anti-stress, calm and connection system, but also high levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is the alertness. So that's why when you see a picture of a baby, when they're first born, they're wide-eyed and alert, right? That's a baby born after physiological birth. So for example, a baby born after a pre-labor cesarean that hasn't had any labor is often kind of drowsy, like they haven't had that kind of whole wake-up call or the good stress of being born, as it's been called, in labour and birth. So we have this alert baby. The mother, at the pushing stage, she can have, if she's had like a full physiology and what's called the fetus ejection reflex, she could also have high levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline to give her the strength to stand up and push her baby out. And then for both of them in the first hour after birth, those levels quite rapidly go down, and they're counteracted by these oxytocin elevations. And the oxytocin in the mother can be up to 10 times higher than what they were at that moment of birth. So imagine that, like even 10 times higher from one of the studies. And that only happens for the mother and the baby, actually, because they're skin to skin together. Yeah, so skin to skin contact, it's the evolutionary norm. Like for 65 million years, there's nowhere else for the baby to be. You put the baby down, it wouldn't be there when you turned around again. So skin to skin on the mother's body, the environment of evolutionary adaptation, it's been called. So, and when the baby goes on the mother's body, like every other mammalian baby, it knows how to climb itself up to the nipple and self-attach, the breast cord. You can look up videos of that. Because the baby is in this state, they've got oxytocin to calm them down, but they've still got some alertness hormones to give them the energy to crawl up. And on the way, they step on the mother's uterus and kind of stimulate it to contract as well. The baby, before they start suckling, will often do a hand massage. And that hand massage in the early time after birth, that's the one that can increase the mother's oxytocin 10 times, the pre-breastfeeding behaviours. And usually with a breast crawl, it can take a baby 40 minutes, even a bit more than an hour to actually start suckling. It's a whole process. We can't push the river. It's just the baby takes its time. The baby has to wake up. The baby rests a bit. There's a whole series of stages that the baby goes through. But basically the hormones, so that initial high levels of catecholamines makes mother and baby alert. Then the skin to skin is going to increase their oxytocin. They're both going to settle down, relax. Often the mother will be upright giving birth, and then she'll kind of just gradually lay herself down, which is the perfect position for the baby, and the breast crawl and the self-attaching and the getting to know each other. These high levels of oxytocin, they're social affiliative hormones for both of them. So they're curious. They want to know each other. The mother will explore the baby will explore the mother. This uninterrupted hour after birth is so important. as we said, an early sensitive period in all mammals. And we know that because things that happen at that time can have significant, much bigger impacts later on. For example, one of the initiatives around the world is called the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, BFHI, World Health Organization. That's been going for maybe 15 years, and it's an initiative to promote breastfeeding and to promote breastfeeding success. And one of the steps of the BFHI is that mother and baby are together in that hour after birth, because it promotes breastfeeding. The baby's in this ideal situation, the mother's in the ideal situation, the baby initiates breastfeeding in that hour or so after birth, then breastfeeding is going to be more successful. We know that. But there's also been some interesting studies around attachment and kind of, say, emotional regulation. And one of them was a really interesting study done by my supervisor, Kirsten Uvnas-Moberg, and her colleagues in the 80s in Russia. And at that time, this PhD student was from Russia. And at that time in Russia, I don't know if it still is, the default was to, the babies are born, take them away, put them in, wrap them all up, swaddle them in like a little babushka and put them in these long lines of plastic boxes in the nursery, right? That was the default. So in this study, they randomized some of those babies to skin-to-skin contact in the first 2 hours after birth. Some of the babies are randomized to being swaddled and then given to the mother. Some of the babies are randomized to being taken away to the nursery, but later on given back to the mother. And then they could compare those different groups. And they actually followed these babies up 1 year after birth. And what they found they videotaped the interactions and obviously analysed them in a blind way, like who analysed them didn't know what the mothers and babies, what group they were in. But when they had that skin-to-skin contact in the first 2 hours after birth, basically they got on better with each other. They had a more smooth flow, that the children were more emotionally regulated. And those things from like this little tiny window, the 2 hours after birth. And there's other studies like that too, showing more sort of bonding behaviours between mothers and babies when they have that skin-to-skin in the hour after birth. So very, very important time.
That's absolutely incredible.
So important.
Yeah. It's so interesting. Once you really grasp what's happening in the body naturally for labour and birth and postpartum, then you understand how impactful interventions are. Like, I don't think we realise as women, you sort of, put your trust in the hospital and the medical professionals if they say you need an intervention, or they, are going to go ahead and do one without thinking. You don't realise the gravity of it. So I would love our listeners to know sort of some of those main interventions and how they affect the body and the process and the real significance of it, because it does have a huge impact, doesn't it?
Yes, well, one of the first interventions I could mention is something that was happening very much until recently, was separation of the baby and the mother. Like when I did my training in hospitals, I was taught to take the baby away, take it to the wall, like put it on the little plastic box and examine it, and then sort of wrap it up and wipe it down and give it back to the mother. And when we do that, we're interrupting that whole like skin to skin, the baby's process. A study actually looked at that, where they looked at babies that were separated just for that kind of weighing and measuring and then given back, and it interrupted those babies' breastfeeding behaviours. They didn't have such a good initiation of breastfeeding. Yeah, so taking the baby away is a major intervention. And the other thing about it, remember how I said that the mother releases her own oxytocin in relation to her baby, the interactions with her baby. So if we take the baby away, then the mother doesn't have those opportunities to release her own oxytocin. We've caused what I call a hormonal gap, right? Something didn't happen that should have happened. And then for decades, we've had to give women synthetic oxytocin to fill in that gap, to make their uterus contract, to stop them from bleeding, because we took their baby away. And there's many examples of that we'll get to. But I'll start with the other interventions we've looked at. So we looked at, well, first of all, I should start with induction of labour, actually. So we couldn't look at that as a separate thing. Like studies didn't look at induction of labour versus not in terms of oxytocin. But for certainly in the past, most of the studies we looked at, the induction of labour was done using synthetic oxytocin, usually with rupture of the membranes if the cervix was open enough. I know more recently it's done with prostaglandins and other different techniques to soften and open the cervix. But anyway, so induction of labour, as I kind of implied is a scheduled birth. So it has things in common with pre-labor cesarean. So the mother hasn't had that full preparation for labor and birth. The baby hasn't had the full preparation. And as I said, we don't even understand what that full preparation is. We don't understand what it is that triggers birth to start today and not yesterday or tomorrow. We know that all of these processes are happening in parallel between the mother and the baby. The mother and the baby are passing signals, hormonal signals across the placenta. For example, the baby's maturing adrenal gland on top of the kidney makes cortisol, and that matures all the baby's organs. And it also makes a precursor, a chemical, DHEA, that goes to the placenta, and then that's made into estrogen that goes into the mother's body, and then it regulates the oxytocin, as we talked about. So this is one of the ways that the readiness of the mother and the readiness of the baby are coordinated. And if you think about it in evolutionary terms, right, that's critical, that the mother's ready for birth and the baby's ready for birth at the same time. Right? That's going to enhance survival for both. So induction is like stepping over all of those things and thinking we know through mathematics, like what the date is, that the baby's ready, and it's just not true. And if you look on my website, there's a couple of blogs about induction. There's a critique of the ARRIVE trial, I won't go into that, but also a more general blog about induction. And I reference some of the studies that have been done recently where they've got large population studies that have measured child development, like school achievement, things like that. And they've correlated that with gestational age, the hospital records. And that you can find that the longer the gestational age, up to at least 41 weeks, in some studies 42 weeks, the better the child's developmental outcomes. So the baby's brain is still developing very rapidly in those last weeks of pregnancy. So again, shutting off that, deciding, the baby's ready is very, we could say, arrogant, to think that. So all of those things about preparation. So if the mother's induced, by definition, she's not ready. By definition, the baby's not ready. We don't even know what all the hormonal gaps are. We can say that likely there's a hormonal gap in her uterine sensitivity, not just to oxytocin, but to all the pro-contractile processes that make her uterus contract in labour. So, often if you're induced, it's harder to get labour started. And some women are induced and nothing happens. They have a failed induction, but it's just their body wasn't ready, right? You don't know. We don't know. 39 weeks, yes, it sounds like a good idea, but that woman might have actually gone into labour at 42 weeks or 41 weeks. She could be 2 weeks away from an actual physiological onset of labour. And all those things obviously apply to a pre-labour cesarean, because not only is there not the full preparation, but there's not the processes of labour and birth. But we'll come back to talk about cesareans. So the first paper we released after the physiology paper was about synthetic oxytocin, and there were quite a few surprises in that. So let's go back to what I said about the increase in oxytocin receptors and that exquisite sensitivity of the mother's uterus in labour, right? So what that means is you can't give her very much synthetic oxytocin. So therefore her levels aren't that high. So even with the highest doses in those studies, her levels were 2 to 3 times what they normally were. And that's not very high biologically. I'm just going to go back to one more thing about oxytocin. So oxytocin, as I said, same molecule that we make, endogenous, natural oxytocin, as synthetic oxytocin, or sometimes called exogenous from the outside, right? So same molecule. But the thing is, with natural oxytocin, we release it from the brain into the body. And as I mentioned, it's released from the brain and into the brain at the same time. So natural endogenous oxytocin is working in our body and our brain at the same time. The stronger the contractions are, by a positive feedback cycle, the more brain oxytocin we have, the more calming, stress-reducing effects to counter that increased stress, right? But synthetic oxytocin doesn't work like that. And one reason is because oxytocin is a simple peptide molecule, and it doesn't easily cross biological membranes. It's not fat soluble. It's not designed to cross biological membranes. So even though it's released from the brain into the body, it can't go from the body back to the brain through what's called the blood-brain barrier. So it can't go from the body back into the brain. So we inject it into the body. It has those oxytocin, fast birth effects, contracts the uterus, but it doesn't directly cause those calming, connecting, pain-relieving effects. So generally, labour, when you're given synthetic oxytocin, whether it's to induce labour or to what we call augment or speed labour up, it causes more painful contractions, stronger contractions than what the body would naturally produce. So that's one of the things we found about synthetic oxytocin. So just one more thing about it, which is that because, before I did this research, I published as you say, the hormonal physiology of childbearing. I'd read lots of papers about oxytocin. I'd read animal research using synthetic oxytocin given to newborns or to mothers in labour, and it goes into the brain and causes all these effects. And I thought that's really bad. It might cause autism. But what we found, but that's not true, because what we found is that you can't give labouring women very much synthetic oxytocin. The levels aren't very high. It doesn't easily cross to the baby or cross to the brain. Like 1,000th of what's in the blood can get across a biological membrane to the placenta or the brain, and the baby's already making it at any rate. So you basically can't directly cause autism. I don't believe that, it causes directly harmful effects for the baby by passage to the baby or passage to the mother's brain. So that was quite a groundbreaking finding. And not only that, but I actually went back and did the maths. So I looked at all the animal studies and I figured out what dose they got and what milligrams per kilogram, because obviously a mouse is like, 10 grams or something, a baby mouse, or smaller. And a human is like, with 70 kilograms, our babies are 4 kilograms, right? 3 to 4 kilograms. So, the relative doses, I figured out the relative doses, and the doses that they were giving in these animal studies was like 100 to up to 1,000,000 times what you could possibly safely give to a labouring woman, because you can't give it that much because she'd get massive contractions and endanger the baby. So that was one of the findings, is that synthetic oxytocin doesn't, or actually can't, directly cause these harmful effects for the baby or for the mother. But on the other hand, I'm not letting it off the hook, right? It can cause indirect effects. So, as I said, synthetic oxytocin causes contractions that are stronger, and actually the most impactful thing is that they're closer together than would naturally happen at that stage of labour. So as you know, contractions start, milder, further apart, get stronger and stronger as labour progresses, closer and closer together, becomes strong enough to push the baby out at the end, right? It's kind of a gradual build-up, like the snowball. But when you give synthetic oxytocin, you get these stronger, closer together contractions. And that closer together is really critical because, for both the mother and the baby. So for the mother, the uterus is a muscle, right? The uterine muscle, that's what causes the contractions. And the muscle is designed to work in a particular way, like good contraction, then relaxation. Because as the muscle contracts, just like a skeletal muscle, it uses up blood and oxygen and glucose, and it produces lactic acid. If there's not enough oxygen in there, it's going to produce a bit of lactic acid. So lactic acid is the molecule that you get in your muscles when you've gone for a long run and your muscles get sore, right? You've overdone it, right? So there's bits of lactic acid produced with each contraction. Then there's relaxation in the uterine muscle. They get blood flow coming through, sweeping away that lactic acid, delivering more glucose, more oxygen for the next contraction, right? So that period of replenishment is really important. So the decreased gap between contractions, the decreased period for replenishment, is not good for the mother's uterus, right? It increases stress on her uterus. It can build up lactic acid, which actually eventually makes the uterine muscle not work so well. And there's actually studies where they gave women alkalinizing agents. I think it was just bicarb soda before labour, and that kind of counteracted the lactic acid, and they didn't have such bad effects. They had better, more effective contractions. So this is an effect that happens from overworking the uterus in labour. So that's the mother, and what we think is that overwork causes physiological stresses in the tissue, which feeds back to the brain as, sympathetic as stress. So it increases stress for the mother, physiological stress, whether you feel it or not. If there's an epidural in place, you might not feel it, but the stress is still happening. So we think that synthetic oxytocin, especially in high doses, could activate the stress system, because labour is an anti-stress overall, an anti-stress event. All these levels of oxytocin to counteract the stress and keep the mother in this low stress as possible, so that oxytocin and the parasympathetic can give effective contraction. So adding more sympathetic is going to unbalance that and causes stress, right? Women say it was more painful, it was more stressful, right? So all of those things for the mother. But for the baby, this is even more important because, as I mentioned, every mammalian baby, there's only one way out, right? Which is through these strong contractions of labour that again get stronger and stronger as labour progresses, and every contraction squeezes the placenta. So the baby's deprived of blood and oxygen inevitably. There's no way around that, right? And the further labour on is, the more strong the contractions, the more frequent the contractions, the more this deficit in blood and oxygen for the baby, right? So the baby has all those problems. But of course, 65 million years of mammalian evolution, there's a lot of things to protect the baby in the womb. And I talked about the catecholamine surge. That's a big one, There's other mechanisms as well. Oxytocin has actually antioxidant, anti-inflammatory effects in the brain. So the baby's increased oxytocin is protective as well. But it's all designed to work in physiology when the baby has the contraction and then the period of replenishment. So that reduced period of replenishment is critical for the baby's well-being in labour and birth. And I'll just mention an animal study. I'm sorry it's a little bit cruel to the animals, but basically it's New Zealand. They do all these studies with lambs. They've got the baby in the womb, the lamb, and they put all these catheters and instrumented it and closed it back up. And then what they actually could do is completely occlude the umbilical cord. So the umbilical cord being how the baby gets the blood and oxygen from the mother, right? It comes into the baby, goes out again. So when you completely occlude the umbilical cord, the baby's getting no oxygen, no blood at all. So they could do that they could do that for a minute, as long as there was an adequate period of replenishment. It was a bit more than 2 minutes. So if it got more frequent than every 2 minutes, the babies progressively got worse and worse, more hypoxic, were born in bad condition. So that period of replenishment, and that's extraordinary. Like human babies no doubt have that too, that they can actually survive a contraction with no blood and oxygen for at least a minute, as long as they have that period of replenishment. And actually human studies have similar findings. Like one paper that we reviewed found that the period of replenishment has to be a minimum of, according to these calculations, 2.3 minutes. Yeah. And that's the problem with synthetic oxytocin. You don't always get those 2.3 minutes. And sometimes the doses are given, it's not a very well standardized drug. And often people giving it don't appreciate how dangerous it is. Like in the US, it was added to a list of a list of medications bearing a heightened risk of harm that require special safeguards. It's a dangerous drug. It's more than half of litigations in obstetrics in the US involve allegations of oxytocin misuse. So, it's a dangerous drug, but we don't always treat it like that. Yeah. So the harms of oxytocin for the mother, increased stress for the baby, increased metabolic stresses that could, and we know, babies that are exposed to that are more likely to end up in NICU and to have temporary brain problems, like all of these things because of that extra stress that we're causing babies. And by the way, most babies, have got the reserves to deal with that. So most babies can deal with that. And I would always recommend, I think it's essential that the mother and baby are monitored if you're having synthetic oxytocin, the baby's heart rate, to see if the baby can actually deal with these contractions. It's not an ideal measurement. There's lots of flaws with it. But I think when you're doing something that consequential to the baby, you really need to measure every contraction, and see if the baby's coping all right. And as I said, most babies can cope all right, and mostly, I think more recently they've had better guidelines around it and the maximum dosages, etc. But some babies, I'd say probably 90% of babies are okay, but there's 10% of babies that go into labour with not such good reserves and get stressed by it, and end up having to get into trouble, even serious trouble, or have a cesarean.
Especially if they're not ready. If you're inducing them weeks earlier, you'd think that they wouldn't quite have, all the reserves that they might have if labour started naturally.
Yes, exactly. And talk about the catecholamine surge. What happens for the baby is that the receptors for that build up in the last weeks of pregnancy as well. So the baby's not going to have the protective mechanisms as strong if the baby's induced as well either. But as I said, the problem is a lot of those studies don't differentiate induction from augmentation. So, it's quite ironic really when we're not only inducing lots of women, I can't remember what our induction rate is at the moment, like 40%. No, don't quote me on that. But at any rate, and we're inducing lots of women, and we don't even know we haven't really well defined or well recorded what the impacts are on babies. So is it actually an overall benefit, especially in modern times with the ARRIVE trial? You can go read my blog, where they're advocating inducing healthy, low-risk women and babies when we don't actually know what the long-term effects are. I think it's very unwise, yeah. And if you're offered an induction, think about it. Like all of these interventions we're talking about have risks and benefits. Like sometimes it is beneficial to the baby, beneficial to the mother. The mother can have conditions like toxemia where it's only going to get worse if she goes through pregnancy, further in pregnancy, and she needs to have her baby. An induction can be life-saving, So all of these things have benefits, but they also have risks, So really, if you're offered these things, be informed of the risks as well as the benefits.
And do we have time to go quickly into cesareans, or?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. So as I kind of alluded to pre-labor cesarean, which has all those scheduled birth things that we talked about. So the baby's not ready by definition, the mother's not ready by definition. They're kind of at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to the hormones and the readiness with the pre-labor cesarean. And again, there's obviously times that the benefits of it outweigh those disadvantages, and then the baby doesn't have that experience of labor and the catecholamine surge in particular. So pre-labor cesarean babies more often have breathing difficulties, because the catecholamine surge not only protects the baby in the womb, but also prepares the baby for life outside the womb. So that's really important to know that there's an increased risk of breathing difficulties for the baby. And obviously the problem with these things is, some of those breathing difficulties are mild, but they're going to interfere with that early sensitive period with the first hour after birth. Your baby's going to be taken away and checked and probably put in special care until they come right, and you're going to miss that sensitive time. So, those things are consequential. We know that the mother's oxytocin system is not activated. The baby's oxytocin system is not so activated. So, as I mentioned before in one of the studies, obviously, after a cesarean, you want to fill in those hormonal gaps as much as possible. You want to have your baby skin to skin on you as soon as possible, but you can't expect that your body will release oxytocin in the same way that you do after physiological birth. So the study showed that the mothers actually didn't release significant amounts of oxytocin in skin-to-skin contact with their baby. So there's a big hormonal gap there, and it needs more than just an hour of skin-to-skin to fill, because we've missed that kind of window of opportunity at physiological birth. So just sharing an anecdote about that. It's a birth story I read of a mother who had 2 natural births and then a pre-labor cesarean for the health and well-being of her baby. And she said, when I got my baby, the baby felt different. And that's, low oxytocin, low catecholamines, the baby's kind of not ready to wake up. She said, my instinct was to be skin to skin with my baby. And after 3 days of skin to skin, my baby felt the same.
Yeah.
So you can fill in these hormonal gaps, but it takes a lot more effort because you've missed that window of opportunity. Yeah. So the baby may be slower to suckle, slower to feed, slower to crawl. So just being patient is really important in terms of that. So pre-labor cesarean, best avoid it if you can, but sometimes if you need to, fill in the hormonal gaps, get the baby on yourself, skin to skin as soon as possible, as early as possible, and have your baby with you. As I said, in evolutionary terms, there's nowhere else for the baby to be, so you can't have too much skin to skin with your baby. And I'll just mention also epidurals, because we haven't covered that. That's the paper I'm working on at the moment. So if we go back to our positive feedback cycle, it depends on the sensations from the cervix and lower vagina. So the trouble with epidurals, the good thing and the bad thing is they're so good at stopping those sensations. So if you stop the sensations, you stop the feedback, and then oxytocin levels go down, contractions tend to slow down or even stop. You get synthetic oxytocin to fill in the hormonal gap, but you've also got a hormonal gap in your brain. You're not getting those calming, connecting, pain relief and rewarding hormones in the brain as well. And these things are hard to measure in women, but certainly in animal studies, when you've given epidurals to sheep or cows or goats, you really interfere with their mothering behavior, especially first-time mothers, and I would say that for all of these hormonal things, like the women who are going to be most impacted are first-time mothers, because you haven't been through all these processes before. Your body isn't adapted to it. It's going to take longer. Labor's going to take longer. Breastfeeding's probably going to take longer, so you don't want to add in anything that's going to interrupt those processes more than necessary. So all that you need, probably more support, more physiology as a first-time mama. So if you can avoid all of these things, induction, pre-labor cesarean, in-labor cesarean, epidurals as a first-time mama, that's really good. So again, going back to my recommendations, if you're going to hospital, take a doula. Otherwise, stay home, have your own midwife, feel private, safe and unobserved. And my take-home messages around those things. And if you go to my website, drSarahJbuckley.com. You can click on all the sites. It's got links to all these articles that I'm talking about. Look at my blogs, my epidural blogs. I've got a picture of the positive feedback loop that I'm talking about. Sign up for my newsletter. I'll send you I'll let you know when the cesarean paper is published. It's just been submitted, hopefully going to be reviewed. So I don't know, could take 2 months or 2 years. It's a known process. Yeah. And then, as I said, we're hoping to submit the epidural paper soon as well. So all those things are in process.
Sarah, you're amazing.
Yep. Amazing. Incredible.
I keep thinking of these questions and then you just answer the question before I say it. You're like inside everyone else's head.
Yeah.
Like it's just such a natural progression of thought. And especially like for me, not being a midwife, I mean, I'm a birthing mother, so I have that lived experience, but
Really expert.
Yeah, this information is just so important, and the research that you've done over the years, and this, I'm really excited to read the new research that you've got coming out too after.
Yeah, will you have more books coming, or is there anything on the horizon?
Yeah. Good question. I need to have a break when I finish my thesis. Yeah, it is on my line to actually update. The publishers really want me to update my book, Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering. So yeah, that. And actually the other thing on my list is to update, because there's an ebook I wrote called Ecstatic Birth, Nature's Hormonal Blueprint for Labour, and that needs some updating too. So yeah, get on my email list and you'll find out about it.
Get on her email list.
Yeah. And we'll post the information on the show notes as well for everyone. Sarah's website and Sarah's books and the research. So all the information will be easily accessible through the website. As well as our Spotify. So thank you so much for coming on and offering your time and your wisdom again, Sarah. We really appreciate it.
Incredible lady. You are.
Yeah,
we need 15 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for all you're doing, guys, and for the beautiful film that's making its way around the world. So exciting. It's going to be on demand soon, right?
We'll be live streaming very, very soon. Very, very soon. This year, I think
it should be December. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, we haven't announced yet, but if you're listening, then you deserve that nugget of information.
Yeah, we're going to get all the tech stuff in line, but hopefully, it'll be on.
So have like an online kind of viewing and
it'll be on our website behind like a paywall similar to Birth Time, where you can go in. Yeah, you can pay for it. Yeah.
We'll send
you
the
overseas
link
as well. Is that going to happen for overseas?
Yes, we'll try and launch in Australia first. I think that's our plan. Yeah, make sure we don't break the website, and then for everybody everywhere.
Cool.
Yeah,
so cool, so beautiful. Okay, well, thanks, guys. Lovely to chat.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
See you again in the future.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.